Okay, so we're opening up the left side of the thorax here. We can see here the parietal pleura. So this is the costal parietal pleura. See the ribs and the intercostal muscles. We can see on the caudal edge of each of these ribs an artery and a nerve. So those are the intercostal arteries and nerves. Okay. And let's look here once again at the intercostal muscles. Our external intercostal muscle is going caudo-ventrally in direction, just like our external abdominal oblique muscle over here. And our internal intercostal muscle is going cranial-ventral, which is going to be the same as our internal abdominal oblique muscle. Okay, so these muscles are active in both inspiration and expiration. Coming back to the pleura, we see here that where the costal pleura reflects onto the diaphragm to become the diaphragmatic pleura, we have our line of pleural reflection. So that's running right about here on this animal. And the lungs, when they're expanded, they're not going to fully fill up this whole space. And so we have this costo-diaphragmatic recess here. And that's going to be a good place if we want to do a thoracocentesis or a pleurocentesis. We want to go in that region so that we do not hit the lungs, but we just collect our fluid without damaging the lungs. But of course that's important to know where that line is so we don't go too far caudally or ventrally and miss the pleural cavity altogether. And the mediastinal parietal pleura. Within the mediastinum, of course, we have the pericardial sac and heart. We'll look at those more closely later. We have in this animal thymus in that cranial mediastinum. And as we saw before, that thymus does extend up into the neck in this animal. So it has a cervical portion. And if we reflect this way up, we can see the caudal mediastinum. And on the other side of it there, the accessory lobe of the right lung. Here we have the left lung. The left lung has a cranial and caudal portion to the cranial lobe and a caudal lobe. We can see real nicely here that not only does this lung have lobes, but it also has lobules. So we have interlobular connective tissue in between those lobules. As I start to pull the lungs away here, I want you to notice that there's this bit of pleura that's attaching to the lungs, to the mediastinum, and that is the pulmonary ligament. So we're going to need to tear that in order to remove our lungs. You can see the line of it right there where it was. Before I remove these lungs totally, I want to show you here, right in here, we have the azygous vein. So ruminants have a left azygous vein, which is going to come around here and then dump into the coronary sinus, okay, or the great cardiac vein just before the coronary sinus. So now I've removed the left lung, and we can see here, so we've got the thymus once again in the cranial mediastinum. We have this nerve here coming across, going to the diaphragm, so that's the phrenic nerve. And here we have the vagus nerve. At this point it's just vagus because it's lost the sympathetic portion, which was going up the neck. We can see that we have this portion that loops around the ligamentum arteriosum. That's going to be the left recurrent laryngeal nerve, and a portion that stays along here. This is going to be the continuation of the vagus, and it's going to have a dorsal and a ventral branch. From both sides, the dorsal branches are going to come together to form the dorsal vagal trunk, and the ventral branches, which I think this might have been it here, to form the ventral vagal trunk that go over the esophagus dorsally and ventrally respectively into the abdomen. Okay? So now we're going to dissect out these vessels cranial to the heart. So we see surrounding the heart here is our pericardial sac. Remember, it's got the pericardial mediastinal pleura on this side. This inner surface is going to be the parietal serous pericardium. And in between the two, we're going to have that tough fibrous pericardium. Okay, so those are the three layers: our pericardial mediastinal pleura, our parietal serous pericardium. Remember, parietal means wall. Okay, so parietal is on the wall, so this is parietal serous pericardium, which means on the heart itself is going to be visceral serous pericardium, also known as epicardium. Okay, so our mediastinum here, some of the caudal mediastinum has been torn, but we can see here, which was present in our cranial mediastinum before we dissect it out, is our thymus. Okay, so we're going to look at this heart more separately later, but we can see here on this left side that both the left auricle and the right auricle are going to be pointing towards you on this side. Here we have our coronary groove, and here it's kind of covered in fat, may be hard to see, is going to be our periconal interventricular groove, because where our right ventricle here narrows, that's the conus arteriosus. So this is periconal, para adjacent, conus adjacent to the conus. So that's periconal interventricular groove. So remember, just like in the dog and in the horse, the right side of the heart is not just right, but it's more cranial, and the left side, which includes the apex of the heart down here, is not just left, but it's caudal. Okay? So, and then above our coronary groove is going to be where our atria are at. Coming off our right ventricle, we're going to have the pulmonary trunk. Pulmonary trunk will divide into the pulmonary arteries, and we can see right here a connection between that pulmonary trunk and the descending aorta, and that's going to be our ligamentum arteriosum. Okay, we'll have a better look at that once I get this heart out of here. Now let's look at these nerve fibers we have running through here once again. So we've got this nerve coming across, going to the diaphragm, must be the phrenic nerve, yep. This one here is going to be the vagus nerve. Okay, so at this point we have lost the sympathetic portion, which is going up to the head, and so we are just the vagus nerve. So left vagus nerve, as it comes down here, it's going to come close to the aorta, and it's going to send off a branch right here, which loops around the ligamentum arteriosum, and that's going to be the left recurrent laryngeal nerve. Okay, the rest of that nerve we see now up here, and it's going to divide just like it did in the dog into a dorsal and a ventral branch. Now in these goats, that ventral branch is often easily broken. Okay, and generally the two sides come together rather early or more cranial. Okay, so this is what's left of our ventral vagal trunk. Our dorsal vagal trunk is going to be formed more caudally up here, where the two dorsal branches come together. Now notice this dorsal branch is going between the esophagus here and a lymph node right here. This is the caudal mediastinal lymph node. I'll show you another view from the other side, which is a little bit better. Okay, so that lymph node, that caudal mediastinal lymph node, if it becomes inflamed, it's going to impinge upon that dorsal vagal trunk, which is going to be our primary parasympathetic control to our rumen, our forestomachs. Okay, here we can see the descending aorta here, and then this vessel right here. We didn't see this in the dog or the horse, but we did see this in the ox. This is the left azygos vein coming down to dump into the great cardiac vein right about at the coronary sinus. Okay? If we come over here, we've reflected our thymus out of the way. So this guy had both thoracic as well as some cervical thymus. Okay? If we reflect that out of the way, we can see the vessels. Just like in the horse and the ox, in the goat, we have just one main trunk of vessels that are going to come cranially to the head, and that's going to be the brachiocephalic trunk. And off of that we'll have each of the subclavia. Okay, so this is the left subclavian artery coming off here. Right subclavian would come off on the right side. And after they come off, we have a bicarotid trunk that then divides into our two common carotid arteries. Okay, can't see the branching real well from this side. Maybe we can from here. So here we see, this looks like it's going to be more of a common trunk. We have our costocervical trunk. It's also a common trunk in this goat with our vertebral artery, which is going to run in the transverse processes of the 2nd through 6th cervical vertebra. Then we'll have our costocervical trunk, which is going to give off the first few intercostals as well as blood supply to the neck. Okay. Then as we come along here, we have this branch here, which is going to be going to the superficial cervical lymph node, so we'll call that the superficial cervical artery. Just opposite of that, over here, hopefully you can see that, we have a branch that is going to stay within the thoracic cavity here, and that's going to be the internal thoracic artery. And after those come off, then we continue around that first rib as the axillary artery. Okay, let's go to the next side. So here we've opened up the right side, and we can see nicely here the right lung. The cranial lobe has both a cranial and a caudal portion, just like it did on the left side. We have a middle lobe here. We have the caudal lobe here. And if we reflect this up, we can see the accessory lobe slipping over the caudal vena cava, and we see that this part here is covered by the plica vena cava, which comes from the mediastinal pleura and then comes up and surrounds the vena cava. You can also see here the phrenic nerve coming on over. Okay, so here we have the costal parietal pleura, the diaphragmatic parietal pleura, the mediastinal pleura, we can see both the caudal and the cranial vena cava now. And here's that phrenic nerve coming all the way across. And next we're going to remove the lung so we can see more structures here. Here I just want to show you real nicely on this side here. You can see where the lung is attached to the mediastinum via a pleural fold, and that's going to be the pulmonary ligament. Now watch me as I carefully tear that pulmonary ligament to free that caudal lobe of the lung from the mediastinum. Okay. Now here's something else that's important to point out in ruminants as well as in porcine. We have this accessory or tracheal bronchus that's coming off before our carina to go into the cranial lobe. Okay, so that's one of our differences between the ruminant and the horse, is that we have this accessory or tracheal bronchus going into the right cranial lobe. Okay, so now we've removed the right lung. You can see here once again it has a cranial and caudal portion to the cranial lobe, and you can see the nice lobules of these lobes. We have the middle lobe, we have the caudal lobe. Remember, the caudal lobe is always thick and rounded at the dorsal aspect, and then we have our accessory lobe here. Okay, we can also see here that the cranial lobe has its own primary bronchus that's coming off way up here. Okay, so here we've got the trachea coming down. Down here is where it divides into the primary bronchi at the carina. But we've got this accessory, sometimes called accessory, sometimes called tracheal bronchus. Okay, so accessory bronchus or tracheal bronchus way up here, which supplies the cranial lobe of the right lung. Okay, both the cranial and caudal portion of it. And so our primary bronchus down here is going to do the rest of our lung. Okay, let's set that lung aside and have a look at what we see down here. Okay, so once again there's our trachea, here's our esophagus, there's our ventral vagal trunk, and our dorsal vagal trunk is here. They're not quite joined yet from either side, but they will soon back here. But you can see this great big cigar-shaped lymph node in here, and that is that caudal mediastinal lymph node that we mentioned before. Okay, which may impinge on this dorsal vagal trunk, okay, causing trouble with indigestion. Okay, so over here on the right side we can also see a vein coming down here to empty into the cranial vena cava. That's going to be the right azygous. So in our ruminants we have both a left and a right azygous, which makes that word azygous kind of not a good word because azygous means unpaired. Oops. Okay, so here we've got the cranial vena cava, we have the caudal vena cava. Once again we can see the phrenic nerve running right along through here. Down here around the trachea and bronchus we have a lot of little lymph nodes. Okay, these are the tracheal bronchial lymph nodes. Okay, those are more important in the horse than in the dog, but yeah, we do have them here in the ruminant as well. And then we'll come back, as I said, to look at the heart later. This is really nice right here. This little mesentery is the plica vena cava, which comes off the mediastinum and comes and attaches to the caudal vena cava. Up here we can see branches of our right subclavian. So once again we have this common branch here, which is both our vertebral artery and our costocervical trunk. Then we have that superficial cervical, which we can actually see on this side, coming to the superficial cervical lymph node. We have remaining inside the thorax this guy here, which is going to be our internal thoracic. And then this is our axillary coming around. And here we can see some lymph nodes right here. These are going to be our caudal deep cervical lymph nodes. We may see some in here with the thymus, which would be our cranial mediastinal lymph nodes. Okay? Just wanted to show you real nicely on this side. We've got the common carotid artery and the vagosympathetic trunk coming down. And that vagosympathetic trunk, somewhere about the level of this first rib, is going to separate into the sympathetic trunk, which will run up here along the vertebra, and after the cervicothoracic ganglion is going to join with the vagus at the middle cervical ganglion to head up the neck. There we go.